Okay, so the last thing on the menu is a talk from Hito Steyerl, who's a writer and artist living in Berlin. After Hito's talk, I will give a short response and also wrap up a little bit of the proceedings. So, welcome, Hito.
Thanks a lot, Simon. Thanks a lot for coming back, and thanks a lot for having me. The paper, or the talk I'm going to give, is not new. I wrote it for a conference organized by Peter Osborne and his colleagues in January in Berlin. Trying to remember what the conference was called, but sorry, I don't know. Anyway, the point I want to make is that the fact that is not new is sort of the point. The title is The Terror of Total Dasein. And it starts with an anecdote which I actually dug up online because at that time they were asking me to make comments on the phenomena of art strike, and I realized I had no idea about historical art strikes whatsoever. So I went online and immediately I found a very, very fascinating example. The example of the so-called International Artist Strike in 1979, which was organized by the legendary Belgrade conceptual artist Goran Đorđević. And Goran Đorđević wrote letters to a lot of artists around the world, and he received 39 replies by different artists, including Sol LeWitt, Lucy Lippert, Vito Acconci, and so on. And basically, none of them were supportive. There is one letter by Susan Hiller, which wrote, "I have in fact been on strike all summer, but it has not changed anything, and I'm anxious to begin to work again, which I shall do very soon." There was another letter by Daniel Buren, who said, basically, "Dear Goran, thanks for your letter. Personally, I am already on strike of producing any new form in my work since 1965, that is, since 14 years. I don't see what more I could do. Best regards, Daniel Buren." So basically most of the letters were expressing mild suspicion of the idea, to say the least. And at this time, this came as a sort of surprise, maybe, for many people to realize that the idea of the strike in the world of art was not working so well, and it was certainly not working as well as in other fields of labor. Clearly there was something very different because, in other fields of labor, a strike would drain, a labor power needed by some employers, and they would then ideally make concessions to workers' demands, but it seemed not to be the case in the art field. And I think by now, no one would be surprised, that this is not working, because I don't think, at least no one of my colleagues expects that his or her labor power is not immediately replaceable, right? It's totally expendable. It's one of the most expendable things you could imagine, because in the age of rampant self-employment, which one could actually rather call self-unemployment, the idea that anyone would care for what specifically you or me do is absolutely exotic. One of the reasons might be that, the current contemporary art field, in my view, very surprisingly relies a lot on the idea of presence, right? Presence seems to be more precious, somehow more valuable than the capacity to produce, let's say, an object or a product. And presence, really in a literal way, as in physical presence, as in, being there, being in attendance, being somewhere in person. So the question is, why is presence such a good object in brackets. Somehow it evokes vague ideas of, the promise of unmediated communication, the glow of uninhibited existence, unalienated experience, and an authentic encounter between humans. And it implies that everyone shares the same physical space. There is a real discussion, a real exchange, communication. The event is happening, there is liveness, there is the real thing really going on. So this is more or less the vague idea or the set of ideas that is connected to the idea of presence. But in addition to that, there is a whole range of basically services that artists are expected to deliver, additionally to whatever is considered as being their artworks. And these services, one of which is the presence service, slowly seem to become much more important than the artwork itself. The Q&A, for example, becomes, I see this very quite often because, I'm in essence a filmmaker. So I'm used to sending the film somewhere and it will do its own thing. I don't need to be there. I'm really happy about it. But a screening nowadays is not interesting or experienceable if there is not a Q&A, if you don't see the author, as if it would make any importance. But if you don't permanently present and discuss and frame the work, it somehow doesn't seem to work. And there is a whole jumble of, extra quasi-activities and services that you have to perform that deal with PR formats, social media formats. You have to present the abstract, the abstract of the abstract. It's almost like you have to already pre-deliver the tweet of the lecture, when you announce it. So basically, all these side activities have become very much, they have increased, they have definitely been multiplied, and also the different formats in which something like a so-called unalienated presence is supposed to be delivered, which means that the artist has to be present, right? You remember Marina Abramovich's eponymous performance title. And what's more, it's not enough to be present, but you have to be newly present, or present for the first time, or present for the first time in, or the work has to be newly commissioned, or something like that. If there is not any sort of qualifier of newness, then somehow even presence doesn't work. Which means that artistic occupation seems to be redefined as a demand for permanent presence. And this leads to an endless, repetitive production of seemingly singular events. There is a serial churning out of novelty and immediacy going on. And this, of course, many people have talked about it very prominently. For example, Sven Lüttiken. This leads to a general artistic performance becoming a quantifiable measure of efficiency and total social labor. Of course, the whole economy of art is somehow involved in this economy of present. I think the most entertaining part is the commercial part, right? The market part of the economy of presence, because this is so highly stratified and organized with VIP lists and VIP lists and lounges and guest lists and parties and so on and so on. You can follow all of that in the yellow press. It's absolutely stunning, because this is, of course, the main thing. This is really the main thing. Who is allowed to be present to what? And in many big shows, there is a so-called preview where the so-called professionals are supposed to see the show without being, disturbed by visitors. But this is not longer exclusive enough, right? The real people now, they come for the preview. They already leave for the preview. They are no longer there. You won't see them. So anyway, but also in the other, this I will leave aside because this is not the right occasion. I really want to do a own paper just about that. But anyhow, so more generally, there are, of course, rational economic reasons for this economy of physical human presence, because this physical human presence is usually much cheaper than to ship an artwork, to insure the artwork, to install the artwork, to hang the artwork, to guard the artwork, and so on and so on. So people, you just, get them and then you send them away, and then, it's fine. And also, there is a huge pressure on institutions to create a public, to have an audience. In the UK, there is this fantastic formula called butts on seats. They count basically the asses on the chairs, and this is the legitimacy to get funding for institutions. So, of course, any sort of presence events puts butts on seats, and those are counted, and they provide some, talking points in an economy, in a competition, of course, of institutions competing for scarce public fundings. Also, if people are present, institution can sell tickets or even access to these people. This often takes on the form of so-called master classes or workshops or para-academic formats, so which all capitalize basically on the hopes of people to increase their network or to, squeeze into some chain of contact which might lead to something or not. So, by using these kinds of formats, these hopes can be quantified and also monetized. On the other hand, for many people, presence also means that they have to be, or think they have to be, permanently available without any promise of recompensation. It's somehow related to the function of 0-hour contracts in other sectors, even though, in many ways this is completely different. And this has one main reason, because nowadays, you can reproduce a lot of things, especially data, almost indefinitely, very cheaply. A lot of things can be reproduced, copy-pasted, and multiplied absolutely easily. But human presence is a thing that is scarce, right? I mean, you cannot indefinitely multiply one and the same presence. There are some limits to that. So presence means to be engaged or occupied with an activity, but not to be hired or employed. It means more often than not that you are sort of locked down in a sort of permanent standby mode. You are a reserve element for potential engagement. There's a crowd of extras, to provide statistical weight to an event. And this, very interestingly, brings me to another point, namely, I think that this desire for the aura of presence and this cult of immediacy actually is not the opposite of digital technologies of mediation, but is absolutely closely connected to it. It arises from it even. I found a very obscure book by a person called William T. Mitchell, who was an architect at MIT, who wrote a book called Utopia, and he has a chapter about the economy of presence. What is it? The economy of presence happens when there is a technologically enhanced market for attention, time, and movement. So basically, presence becomes a process of investment that requires choices. How is that? Because, of course, with digital tools, you have a lot more choices than you used to have. You send an email, you send a text message. You don't have to meet the person. You don't have to spend time with them. You don't have to drive through the city, lose time in a traffic jam, and so on and so on. You can just send, or you can communicate on several layers. And to meet someone in person means an investment, of course, of time, of communication, of effort, and so on. And you start thinking very carefully, who am I going to, meet in person or just like on Facebook? So let me find this quote. Presence choice occurs when an individual decides whether face-to-face presence is worth the time or money. And as I said, presence is basically a veiled mode of investment. It's not opposed to technology or mediation, but on the contrary, it is its consequence. On the other hand, this economy of presence is not only relevant for those people, who are being asked to be present or even get paid to be present or shipped around, but even more, I would say, for those persons who have much more time, than they can basically sell or barter. It's much more important for people who have to work multiple jobs, who basically have to be in several places more or less at the same time, in order to make a living. It is even more important for those people who have to coordinate, this jumble of micro jobs. There is a logistical nightmare of trying to, harmonize competing schedules, negotiating priorities, people that are on permanent standby, basically in the hope that that their presence, that their time will eventually become exchangeable for something else. And this aura of the unmediated, exclusive, precious presence is based on an infrastructure that consists of absolutely fractured schedules, dysfunctional and collapsing just-in-time economies in which people basically frantically try to figure out all these reverberating asynchronicities and the continuous breakdown of timetables. This is a kind of time, labor time, contemporary labor time that I call junk time. It's broken down and it's completely kaput. Junk time is wrecked and discontinuous, it is distracted, it runs in parallel on different tracks and it's generally out of control. Listening to Sami, I was thinking it is absolutely not homogeneous empty time, it is more like heterogeneous crap time. And I think that this is basically constituting the temporal base of the more, basically not only artwork, of more or less many kinds of labor that people are doing right now. You can immediately recognize whether you live within junk time or not, because in junk time you're not always in the wrong place at the wrong time, but you're in two wrong places at the wrong time. And somehow you manage. And with junk time, causality is totally scattered. The end is somewhere, it's before the beginning, but the beginning has been taken down because of copyright violations. Anything in between has been slashed for budget cuts or displaced into a different lecture hall, which you're never gonna find any time ever. So this kind of junk time, I think, is the material base for the idea of pure, unmediated, and endless presence. So how does this junk time relate to a cult of presence? And this is a question, because I'm not a philosopher, and it concerns the title of the talk, which also last time I put to, so to speak, public approval, because I have the hunch that this cult of presence revitalizes Heideggerian ideas about Dasein in an age of task rabbits and Amazon turkeys. So is the cult of this embodied engaged presence that cannot be copied and pasted, is this an expression of the relentless quantification of everything within most contemporary occupation? Is it going hand in hand with the body count performed by institutions to prove their perceived importance by attendance numbers, while simultaneously, of course, harvesting visitors' data, their preference? They have to fill questionnaires, their mobile phones are being skimmed to find out how many seconds they spent in front of which artwork, that really, really happens. So, is this fragmented junk time of multiple occupations, the necessity of multiplying and juggling scraps and shreds of time, is this creating the conditions for this kitsch ideal of an unalienated, uninterrupted, radiating, endless, awful Anwesenheit? And I think, if some of you agree, I suggest to call this text the Terror of Total Dasein. We can discuss this later, quantify it somehow maybe. So let's come back to the topic of strike, because I think in an economy of presence, a strike would happen by somehow withholding your presence, by being absent. But you know, this kind of complicated presence I describe is already constituted by integrating different levels of absence, right? It's a basically continuum of withdrawal. So basically you cannot just withdraw, because withdrawal is already integrated into the idea of presence somehow. Let me just run through very basic model situations how this could work. So, for example, what would happen if instead of the artist that was present, there was not an artist, that there was a monitor on a table through which the artist was basically stare at the audience in a sort of pre-recorded loop, which for budget reason would rather be an animated GIF, I suppose, which would be a totally banal question, but it would get much more interesting if the audience also was not there, right? You would just put basically your program on your chair to indicate that you just went to the bathroom, but you never come back. But on the other hand, I think that the real life solution that many people find, and I see this over and over and I really like it, is that people actually, in many dark lecture halls, you know, I give a lecture and I see all these faces illuminated by the little screens, and I know they are checking their emails or their Twitter feed or their Facebook, and they are pretending to be present in 3 or 4 different other places at the same time. And so basically this is a very, very legitimate form of absence management, I think. You know, I'm totally for it. I think this is absolutely perfectly fine to go about your junk time commitments while you pretend to listen to me. I think this is one of the ways, you know, to escape the terror of total Dasein. And this is also one of the examples I have of what I call proxy politics, because a proxy is a kind of stand-in, or it's, you know, a dummy in effect. A dummy you use to simulate presence when you're basically not there. So it allows you to be in different places at the same time. And a proxy politics is basically trying to utilize this to create a politics of the stand-in, or maybe more precisely, the decoy. The idea of proxy as such is very interesting, because it could be, you know, a body double or a stunt double. It could, of course, be a node in a network. It could be a scan or a scam or a bot, or, you know, one of my favorite proxies are these inflatable tanks. Have you ever seen them? They are used to pretend there's a real tank, but there is no real tank. There's just an inflatable huge device. You could use it also in a swimming pool or something. So, of course, proxy is a very, very important notion in contemporary warfare, which is largely conducted through proxy militias, proxy entities. It could also be something as simple as a template or a ready-made. And all these things have one thing in common: they help, you know, to manage these classic dilemmas which arise when you got to be in several places at the same time. And I will give you a small example of such device. It's also printed as a stand-in for an abstract, which is this classical dummy for graphic designers called Lorem Ipsum. I think you all know it, right? I mean, if you ever open a graphic design template, this will come up, because this is what happens when no one has the time to write the text, you know. So this is basically the standard dummy in graphic design. So it's very, very important for many people who perform digital labor. The interesting thing is that Lorem Ipsum, of course, it's not only a dummy, it's also a text, or some form of text, let's put it like this. And it is a jumbled version of a treatise by Cicero about ethics, which is called On the Ends of Good and Evil. And in this treatise, there's different versions, you know, of good and evil, which are compared, and people, you know, praise the benefits of good, and the others praise the benefits of evil, and they cannot find really a resolution. It's extremely boring. I tried to read it. I cannot really recommend it. But Lorem Ipsum is more or less a couple of phrases which are extracted from Cicero's text, and I would like to, this is basically how it came about. This is one of the versions in which De Finibus was printed, and it starts on this page with the words Lorem Ipsum, and Lorem is not even a full word, it's just a part of a word. This is the original. Neque porro quisquam escit dolorem ipsum quia dolor sit ame consectetur adipisci vili. And it means, neither is there anyone who loves, pursues, or desires pain itself, because it is pain, but there are cases when labor and pain can procure some great pleasure. This is genius, isn't it? I mean, I was so happy when I found it, because, you know, this is such a classical slogan for traditional capitalism. You suck up now, you know, you endure the pain, you give it all you have, and later on there will be, might be, maybe some pleasure. I think Max Weber called this, I might be wrong, but deferred gratification is the thing that comes to mind in my head when thinking about this kind of phrase. But you shouldn't forget that this is not Lorem Ipsum. This is Cicero. Lorem Ipsum is much more interesting. So this is the translation of Lorem Ipsum, because Lorem Ipsum is a jumbled version, right? And if you translate it, it says, in of itself, because it is pain, but circumstances occur in which labor and pain can procure him some great... So you don't know, you know? It's just left suspended. There should be some pleasure, but it's gone. You know, there is no pleasure. There's no pleasure. There's not even a fee in the end, right? You just labor and pain and toil ahead because you think if you just defer the gratification, it will come. But in the Lorem Ipsum idea, no, there is no more gratification. No? I mean, forget about getting paid. Pain is not a means to an end, but it just so happens, you know. Okay. And this is interesting because you see, I mean, Lorem Ipsum is wildly jumbled. They grab bits and pieces of the original and recombine it in different versions. So somehow it has the same structure as junk time, right? Junk time is scrambled time, completely cut up. Lorem Ipsum has kind of the same structure. These fragments are scrambled, they are cut up, they are shut up, they are confused in their sequence. They spoil the glow of uninterrupted, you know, meaning radiating from the text. And you know, there is something really uncanny to Lorem Ipsum since I found out that it's been written by Cicero. Anytime I see it in my head. Oh, it's a bit gross, but it's true. You know, Cicero's head and hands were also cut off after he was assassinated, and they were nailed to the rostrum on the Forum Romanum. So every time I think of it, there is this idea of a massive intervention, no? which in this case also not only results in cutting up text, but really literally physically cutting up body. There is a really interesting variation of Lorem Ipsum on a Berlin club, sex club website. It is in Bergheim, it's called Laboratory, and they have a page where they say rules of conduct, but actually it's only Lorem Ipsum, which I find really interesting, because I think that Lorem Ipsum, of course, in this case, is the rules of conduct. So this is how you should please conduct yourself in this institution. And also, if you try to translate it, it's got a few variations in relation to the standard, Cicero mashup, because the pleasure is back, in this version. You wouldn't want to miss it, right, in this location. But it is back in a very, very in a different, also quite scary configuration, because it integrates the virtues of physical exercise, which completely makes sense in a club which also has an athlete fetish party on offer. And this version kind of wildly loops back between pain, toil as pleasure, labor as pleasure, and physical exercise and sports. So this is, someone really managed to translate it, and you see that it totally morphs back between, it forms, so to speak, a never-ending loop, in which the pursuit of pleasure, labor, physical exercise, and sex form some kind of inescapable hell. So you first have to find pleasure through work, then you have to work out, and then you have to have sex, and in this order and without any break, and then you loop again. And this sounds like basically the junk time version of this famous quip that Winston Churchill once made. He said, if you're going through hell, then keep going, right? And this is basically the same, because there is no more exit to this kind of, feedback loop between all these activities. If you keep going, it means there will just be more hell ahead. And reading this kind of instruction, you have the feeling that Lorem Ipsum, or the idea of dummy, could also have a completely different function, because, if I read it, I think, it kind of sounds too exhausting for me. I would like to send Lorem Ipsum or a dummy, to do a proxy, to do all these things on my behalf, because this is also just too time-consuming, and I have to be physically in that place, and how am I going to check my emails at the same time? It's just not possible anymore. So this is what led me actually to another idea, namely the idea that in contemporary art there is a huge preoccupation with stock footage, for example, right now, or serialized images of products, for example, of commodities. There's all sorts of templates for creative labor going on. I mean, PowerPoint templates, which include Lorem Ipsum being just one example of it. There's After Effects templates, openers, jingles, all these kind of things. So what does this preoccupation in artistic practice with the template, what does it mean? Are basically all of these proxies that you can more or less insert to substitute for labor which you cannot afford to do because there's so much to be done anyway? Is this a sort of applied absenteeism, so to speak? Is this a sneaky boycott of constant presence? The point is that people, of course, use proxies all the time. I mean, it's a lived practice. It happens every day to deal with this terror of total Dasein, to deal with an economy of presence which is based on the technologically amplified scarcity of human attention and physical presence. And the funny thing is that even, the strike organizer Goran Đorđević, who I mentioned at the beginning, trying to organize an art strike in 1979, also started pursuing his own version of proxy politics after the failed art strike, because he completely stopped making art under his own name. And years later, he re-emerged, but not as an artist. He re-emerged as a technical assistant for the lecture series of an equally obscured theorist called Walter Benjamin. So Goran Đorđević has reappeared as assistant on Walter Benjamin's recent lecture tours and kind of has represented him, even though half-heartedly, ever since. The only thing we don't know is whether Benjamin himself ever appeared to his lectures or whether he went on strike. Thank you.
Thank you, Hito. One of the things that struck me in your discussion of presence was, of course, how the notion of presence also has a history within art making itself, not just in terms of performance art, but it was, of course, the main point of consternation in the struggle between formalist art theory of Greenberg modernism and minimalist sculpture. The famous article by Michael Fried, Art and Objecthood, is an attack on minimalist sculpture because it is of its presence. Instead, it has too much presence. This is a problem. Instead, he offers another term. He ends the article famously and kind of quasi-religiously by focusing instead on presentness. And he says at the end, presentness is grace. So looking back, of course, at that debate, one can wonder why particularly something like minimalism would be so annoying to a formalist. It seems like a fairly formal way of making art. But I think it, of course, has to do with this notion of objecthood, and therefore also to do with the notion of art and labor, not after the end of work, but after the end of the artwork. Namely that what it was visible in this kind of work was labor. That you could literally see how these strange pieces of plywood were stuck together. So it was a kind of almost demystification of the presentness of the artist that was embodied in formalist artworks, such as the ones by Alexander Calder that he, strangely enough, favored. And I wonder, of course, if we can also see a return to presentness in contemporary art, namely in this idea of a post-internet art production, where there is no artwork that needs to be present. It's according to the theory of post-internet art and archivierkant. You do not need to produce the work. What's important is its endless possible repetition, reprinting from 3D printers, and distribution. Of course, when this work is shown, which requires then no crating, no transport, no insurance, it always requires the artist's presence. So in that sense, the presence it gives value to the work, I think. To the notion of strike, it's of course, I think that Đorđević was of course inspired by Gustav Metzger, who famously went on strike for 3 years, from 1975 to 1977. I believe it was, and later commented that nobody noticed that he had gone on strike. So there was no invitations, no communication. So it was a completely more than a withdrawal. It was almost like a kind of death of the artist. He just totally disappeared in those 3 years. Nobody took any notice of the strike, which then raises, of course, the issue of the location of a strike, which I think we also talked about throughout these 2 days, and to whom the strike is directed. Because if you're self-employed, what would it mean to go on strike? Who are you striking against? It's the same with these kind of presence things that we're talking about here. So if, for example, we had decided to go on strike today and not show up, we would not get paid. There would be no recompensation in terms of a union that would say to us, well, we will pay you for that day of labor that you lost. Because it's a self-employed contract that we would be working under. So there are some complications, I think, in terms of art strikes that has to do, of course, with the position of the artist, not only as a worker, which is one point of identification, but also that they have the category of being an entrepreneur. So entrepreneurs are self-employed and do not go on strike. So to go on strike, you need to have a demand towards an employer. So it would be strange to go on strike against yourself. Which reminds me, of course, of another of Hito's work about the museum as factory that I think it's interesting to bring into this discussion. Namely, to think of museums like this one as factories, we will see that there are, of course, many relations of labor involved in the arts sector. And art workers are not just the artists, but all the people around here doing various jobs on various types of contracts and various pay scales. And one of the things that you mentioned that I thought was interesting was, of course, the Amazon Turkos. And perhaps I think we are now in this situation where we should no longer talk about art workers only, but also about art Turkos. That more and more of us are art Turkos, doing these useless small jobs on maximum or minimum amount of time and for a minuscule pay. But this is at the same time, of course, relate to some of the discussions that we had earlier in this public editorial meeting, the work that the computer cannot do. So this is the work that the machine cannot do. That's what the Turker is doing. With that, I will end, but just with reference to our title. That, of course, what we meant to say was that the end of work might be, on the one hand, a negative horizon of the fact that there is no work to be found, dealing with unemployment, poverty, etc. It was also meant to indicate the changes in art production itself, but to say if there are no artworks in a dematerialized contemporary art practice, there's still lots of labor. Was what we were aiming at. Secondly, of course, I think that the end of work could also be a positive horizon, namely to detach from the notion of work and detach from the idea of the right to work as what gives you social rights. So to actually try and say that maybe the dematerialization that has been happening in our business could lead to thinking of a life after work and without work. Thank you.
Can I just respond very briefly? Okay, just 3 small points. I think that one of the things I'm just would like to add, that maybe the objecthood in digital art, or post-digital art, is not really the point, because, it materializes all the time. This is when it, acquires value, actually. So it is mostly material, to be honest. But I think that there is a point to be made that regardless of the material quality of the artwork, there's something missing, which is also a digital term, which is animation. Regardless whether the work is online, material or not, it still requires animation, and animation always has this hybrid, zombie-like, technical quality. So presence, I think, is an attempt to animate really with post-production technologies, spaces which somehow seem undesirably dead to some. I like dead spaces. It's fantastic. It's absolutely fine with me. So it's an attempt of animation, in my view, rather than to, supply missing material presence. It is there. I really love the idea that the artist is the Turker, because it means that the artist, if he or she does the things that the computer could not do, is in the role of being the person who constantly needs to figure out the captcha, right? And constantly fill in these, completely meaningless series of letters and numbers in order to prove to your computer that you're not a machine. This is the role that the artists have, provide the capture for the system to work. And I have a last small point, you know, I mean, I'm usually absolutely opposed to, I'm unable, let's put it like this, unable to point any way to anywhere. I have no idea usually what to do next or what to do at all. I prefer doing nothing, but I think that one thing really struck me as a question when I started thinking about the Turkers, Amazon Turkers, because, you know, the Turkers already have founded the Turkers nation, they have founded their sort of online constituency and so on. So they have started to organize transnationally and so on and so on. But the thing that struck me actually was when I was in Urfa, which is in southeast Turkey, and I saw a mosaic, Roman mosaic of Amazon queens. And it really, this was the first time this again struck me that the Amazon has this double meaning, right? It is, of course, this company, it is also a female fighter. And I started really wondering what happens if one supplants the, you know, Amazon digital Turk with the Amazon digital Kurd. This was really my question, and I think this is something one could try to follow.
Okay, so on that note, I would like to thank everybody who assisted us and everybody for coming. Thanks.